Growing up in a small town in Ohio, Paul Weston always believed in the sanctity of marriage. His parents, Nancy and George, had a storybook relationship, or so it seemed. They laughed often, supported each other, and made family life feel like a safe haven. To Paul, their bond was unshakable, a model he vowed to emulate when he found the right person. In his junior year at the University of Chicago, Paul met Emily Harris. She was the exact opposite of him, bubbly, outgoing, and brimming with charisma. Paul was quieter, more methodical, and often content to sit back and observe the world rather than be its center of attention. But somehow, their differences fit together like pieces of a puzzle. After graduation, Paul and Emily married in a quaint ceremony at a lakeside lodge. Life unfolded exactly as Paul had hoped. They moved to Indianapolis, bought a cozy suburban home, and soon welcomed their two sons, Alex and Ethan. Paul's job as a mechanical engineer kept the bills paid, while Emily worked part-time as an interior designer, a role that allowed her to be present for the boys. From the outside, they were the epitome of the American dream. Their family thrived in those early years. Weekend trips to the zoo, pizza nights, and long summer evenings playing catch in the yard were routine. Paul often caught himself smiling at the simplicity of it all. This is it, he'd think. This is the life I always wanted. But as time passed, the dynamics of their marriage began to subtly shift. Emily, always the social butterfly, started spending more evenings out with friends. Just wine nights, she'd say with a dismissive wave of her hand. Paul didn't mind at first. He trusted her implicitly and figured that being married didn't mean they had to spend every waking moment together. Still, Paul began noticing small changes that unsettled him. Emily's phone, once casually left on the kitchen counter, was now glued to her side. She'd chuckle at text messages, but quickly close the screen when he entered the room. Paul brushed it off. Don't be paranoid, he told himself. The first real crack in their perfect world appeared one Friday evening. Paul was folding laundry in the living room when Alex, their 9-year-old, wandered in. "Mom's going out again tonight?" he asked, his voice tinged with disappointment. Paul nodded, feeling a pang of guilt. Emily had been more absent lately, and the kids were starting to notice. "She said she'd read me a story," Alex muttered before trudging upstairs. Later that night, Emily returned home, her cheeks flushed from wine and laughter. She greeted Paul with a kiss on the cheek that felt more obligatory than affectionate. He decided to let it go, chalking it up to the stress of modern parenting and the demands of their busy lives. Weeks turned into months, and Paul's unease grew. Emily's outings became more frequent, her explanations vaguer. Then came the night that changed everything. Paul had just put the boys to bed when he noticed Emily's tablet on the counter. He wasn't the type to snoop, but something compelled him to look. As he opened the device, his heart sank. Messages between Emily and someone named Mark painted a picture he couldn't ignore. Their exchanges were playful, intimate, too intimate for comfort. Paul's hands shook as he read one particular message. "Last night was amazing. I can't wait to see you again." His world, the one he'd worked so hard to build, suddenly felt fragile and meaningless. Emily walked into the room at that moment. Her smile froze as she saw the tablet in Paul's hands. "What's this?" he asked, his voice trembling. For a moment, Emily said nothing. Then, with a deep breath, she confessed. "Paul, it's not what you think. Mark and I are just friends." "Friends?" Paul interrupted, holding up the screen. "This doesn't look like friendship to me, Emily." Her face crumpled, and she sank into a chair. "I didn't mean for this to happen," she whispered. It just did." The betrayal hit Paul like a freight train. He stared at her, searching for answers that her tears couldn't provide. "Why, Emily?" he finally managed. "What did I do wrong?" "It's not about you," she said, her voice breaking. "I love you, Paul. I love our family. But I needed something more, something different." Her words were a dagger to his heart. Paul thought of their children sleeping upstairs, oblivious to the storm brewing below. That night, Paul slept on the couch, his mind racing with questions. Could their marriage be saved? Did he even want to save it? As the sun rose, he knew one thing for certain. Their picture-perfect life was gone. The morning after Emily's confession was tense and awkward. Paul sat at the kitchen table with a mug of coffee, staring blankly at the yard while the boys chattered about their upcoming soccer practice. Emily moved around the kitchen silently, avoiding eye contact with him. The boys were oblivious, which Paul considered a small mercy. As far as they knew, Mom and Dad were just having a normal day. But beneath the surface, Paul's emotions churned like a storm. After dropping the boys off at school, Paul returned home to confront Emily. She was sitting on the couch, nervously fiddling with her wedding ring. "We need to talk," Paul began, his voice firm but calm. Emily nodded, her eyes fixed on her lap. "How long has this been going on?" he asked. She hesitated, then finally answered, "About 6 months." Paul felt his chest tighten. 6 months? And you didn't think to tell me? Were you planning to tell me at all? Or were you just going to keep sneaking around? "I don't know," Emily admitted. "I wasn't thinking. I didn't want to hurt you. I didn't want to hurt the boys." Paul laughed bitterly. "Well, congratulations. Mission failed." Emily flinched at his tone, but said nothing. "What now?" Paul asked after a long pause. "What do we do from here?" Emily looked up at him, her eyes pleading. "I don't want to lose our family, Paul. I still love you. I don't know what's wrong with me." Paul shook his head. "That's not good enough, Emily. You've turned our marriage into something I don't even recognize. If you want to fix this, you need to prove to me that it's worth saving." The conversation ended with no clear resolution. Emily promised to stop seeing Mark and suggested they try marriage counseling. Paul agreed reluctantly, though a part of him doubted it would help. Over the next few weeks, life at home became a fragile balancing act. Paul threw himself into his work, staying late at the office to avoid the tension at home. Emily, for her part, seemed to be trying. She canceled her social outings, spent more time with the boys, and even suggested family movie nights. But for Paul, the damage was done. Every time he looked at her, he saw the messages, the lies, the betrayal. Trust, once so natural, now felt like an impossible task. One evening, after the boys were in bed, Paul found himself scrolling through online forums about marriage and infidelity. He stumbled upon a thread where someone had written, "Sometimes the best way to heal is to focus on yourself." The words resonated with him. For years, Paul had prioritized his family, his work, and Emily. Maybe it was time to focus on himself for a change. The next morning, Paul woke up earlier than usual and decided to go for a run. It had been years since he'd done anything remotely athletic, but he felt the need to clear his mind. The first few blocks were brutal, his lungs burning and his legs protesting every step. But by the time he returned home, he felt a small sense of accomplishment. He made running a daily habit. Slowly but surely, he built up his stamina, adding miles to his route and enjoying the quiet solitude of the early mornings. Emily noticed the change. "You've been getting up early a lot," she said one evening as they cleaned up after dinner. "Just trying to stay healthy," Paul replied, not looking up from the dishes. She nodded, though her expression was unreadable. As Paul found a new outlet in running, Emily continued trying to mend their relationship. She booked a session with a marriage counselor, and though Paul agreed to go, he did so with skepticism. The counselor, a soft-spoken man named Dr. Freeman, began by asking them to share how they were feeling. "I'm angry," Paul said bluntly. "I feel betrayed. I don't know how to trust her again." Emily looked down, tears welling in her eyes. "I know I messed up. I just want a chance to make things right." Dr. Freeman nodded thoughtfully. "Rebuilding trust takes time and effort from both of you. It won't be easy, but it's possible if you're both committed." Paul left the session feeling drained. He wasn't sure if he believed it was possible, but for the sake of the boys, he decided to keep trying for now. One Saturday, Paul took Alex and Ethan to a nearby park for a soccer match. As he watched them play, he couldn't help but feel a pang of envy for their carefree joy. "Hey, Paul." He turned to see Sarah, one of the other parents, waving at him. Sarah's son was on Alex's team, and they chatted occasionally during practices. "Hey, Sarah," Paul replied, smiling faintly. "You look good," she said. "Have you been working out?" Paul chuckled. "Just running, trying to stay sane." Sarah laughed. "I hear you. Parenting can be crazy sometimes." They talked for a while, and for the first time in weeks, Paul felt a flicker of normalcy. That evening, Emily asked how the soccer game went. It was good, Paul said. The boys had fun. Did you talk to anyone? She asked casually, but Paul detected a hint of tension in her voice. Just Sarah, he said. Emily's expression shifted. Oh, her. What's that supposed to mean? Paul asked. Nothing, Emily said quickly, but her tone suggested otherwise. Paul didn't press the issue, but as he lay in bed that night, he couldn't help but wonder if Emily was starting to feel the same insecurity that had plagued him for months. Though they were still living under the same roof, Paul and Emily felt like strangers. The routines of daily life, dinner, homework, bedtime stories, played out like a hollow performance. Paul wasn't sure how long he could keep it up. Something had to change. He just didn't know what. The strain between Paul and Emily became more apparent as the days passed. On the surface, their household seemed functional. The boys went to school, homework was completed, and meals were shared. But the undercurrent of tension was impossible to ignore. Every conversation between Paul and Emily was laced with unspoken words. Every glance a reminder of the growing chasm between them. Paul threw himself further into his newfound running routine and work. He started waking up at 5 a.m. each day, not just to clear his head, but to reclaim some semblance of control over his life. The runs were brutal at first, but they gave him a focus he hadn't felt in years. He began tracking his progress, setting small goals, and pushing himself further. The more time Paul spent on himself, the less he thought about Emily. He couldn't bring himself to forgive her, and some days he wasn't even sure he wanted to. One evening, after a particularly long run, Paul returned home to find Emily in the living room with a glass of wine. The boys were already asleep. She looked up as he walked in, her face pale and tired. "We need to talk," she said softly. Paul sighed, grabbing a bottle of water from the fridge before sitting down across from her. "What is it?" Emily hesitated, swirling the wine in her glass. "I feel like we're just coexisting, like we're roommates instead of a couple." Paul laughed bitterly. "Roommates don't lie to each other." Her eyes filled with tears. "I'm trying, Paul. I really am. But it feels like no matter what I do, it's not enough." Paul leaned back, his exhaustion outweighing his anger. "Because you broke something, Emily, and I don't know if it can be fixed." They sat in silence for a moment before Emily spoke again. "I've been thinking maybe we need a different kind of arrangement." Paul frowned. "What kind of arrangement?" Emily looked down at her hands. "An open marriage. Something that gives us both space to figure out what we want." The words hit Paul like a punch to the gut. "Are you serious?" "It's just an idea," Emily said quickly. "I thought maybe if we didn't feel so trapped, we could find a way back to each other." Paul stood up, shaking his head. "You think more freedom is the answer? You think I want to share my wife with someone else? Is that what you've been doing with Mark? Testing the waters for your arrangement?" "That's not fair," Emily said, her voice breaking. "I just want to find a way to save us." Paul's voice was cold as he replied, "If this is your idea of saving us, then maybe we're beyond saving." He walked out of the room, leaving Emily alone with her thoughts. The next morning, Paul felt drained. Emily's suggestion replayed in his mind as he laced up his running shoes. He couldn't fathom how she thought an open marriage could solve their problems. To him, it felt like a desperate attempt to normalize her betrayal. During his run, Paul pushed himself harder than usual, letting the physical exertion drown out his emotions. By the time he returned home, he was drenched in sweat but felt marginally clear-headed. Emily was in the kitchen, making breakfast for the boys. She glanced at Paul but didn't say anything. The silence between them was deafening. That weekend, Paul decided to take the boys on a day trip to a nearby state park. They packed sandwiches, grabbed their soccer ball, and headed out early. The park was a sprawling expanse of green fields, wooded trails, and a sparkling lake. The boys ran ahead, laughing and chasing each other while Paul followed with their backpacks. For a few hours, he felt at peace. Watching Alex and Ethan's joy reminded him of why he needed to stay grounded. While they were eating lunch by the lake, Alex suddenly asked, "Why doesn't Mom come with us anymore?" Paul hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "Mom's been busy lately, buddy, but she loves you very much." Alex seemed satisfied with the answer, but Ethan, the younger of the two, looked unconvinced. She's always busy, he said quietly. Paul reached over and ruffled Ethan's hair. Hey, it's not your job to worry about that. You just focus on being a kid, okay? Ethan nodded, though his expression remained serious. When they returned home that evening, Emily was waiting for them. She hugged the boys tightly and asked about their day. Paul noticed how eager she was to hear about their trip, and for a moment, he felt a pang of guilt. Later, as he was unloading the car, Emily approached him. "Thank you for taking them out," she said. Paul nodded but didn't respond. "I meant what I said the other night," Emily added hesitantly. "I'm willing to try anything to make this work, Paul." He turned to face her, his expression weary. "I don't know if I can, Emily. I don't know if I want to." Her face fell, but she nodded. "I understand." As the weeks passed, Paul and Emily continued their uneasy dance. They attended a few more counseling sessions, but the progress was slow and fraught with setbacks. Paul found himself increasingly drawn to the idea of independence, of carving out a life for himself and the boys without the constant weight of Emily's betrayal. One evening, after tucking the boys into bed, Paul sat alone in the living room. He stared at the family photos on the mantel, each one a snapshot of a happier time. He realized he was at a crossroads. He could keep fighting for a marriage that might already be beyond repair, or he could start building a new life, one where he and the boys could find peace. For the first time, the idea of walking away didn't feel like failure. It felt like freedom. Paul spent the next few weeks grappling with his decision. The thought of leaving his marriage felt like stepping into an abyss. He wasn't afraid for himself. He was afraid for the boys. What kind of life would they have if their family fractured? But the longer he stayed, the more he felt trapped in a house filled with unspoken words and broken trust. Emily, meanwhile, seemed determined to act as though everything was fine. She doubled down on her efforts to mend the marriage, preparing elaborate dinners, planning family movie nights, and even suggesting a weekend trip to the lake. But to Paul, her gestures felt hollow. "You can't cook your way back into my heart," he thought bitterly one evening as he pushed food around his plate. One afternoon, Paul received a text from Sarah, the soccer mom he had chatted with at the park. "Sarah, hey, Alex left his water bottle at practice. I'll bring it to the game Saturday, unless you want to grab it sooner." Paul hesitated for a moment before responding. "Paul, Saturday's fine. Thanks, Sarah." Their exchange was brief, but it left Paul with a strange feeling, one he couldn't quite place. For months, his life had revolved around conflict and pain. Talking to someone outside of that world, even for a moment, felt refreshing. That Saturday, Paul arrived at the soccer game with Alex and Ethan in tow. The boys raced to join their teammates, while Paul settled into his usual spot on the sidelines. "Hey, Paul," Sarah called out, waving as she approached. "Hey, Sarah," Paul replied, forcing a smile. She handed him Alex's water bottle. "This kid needs to stop leaving stuff behind," she joked. Paul chuckled. "I think it's a rite of passage at this age." They fell into an easy conversation, discussing everything from the boys' soccer skills to the challenges of parenting. For the first time in weeks, Paul felt like himself again, like a man capable of more than just surviving. As the game ended and the kids ran off the field, Sarah placed a hand on Paul's arm. "If you ever need to talk, I'm around," she said, her tone kind but without any hidden implications. Paul nodded, grateful but unsure of what to say. "Thanks, Sarah. I appreciate that." That evening, Emily was waiting for him in the living room when he returned home with the boys. "You were gone a while," she said, her voice tinged with suspicion. "Yeah, the game ran long," Paul replied, brushing past her to take the boys upstairs for their baths. When he came back down, Emily was still sitting on the couch, her arms crossed. "Who were you talking to at the game?" she asked. Paul frowned. "What are you talking about?" "I saw you talking to Sarah," Emily said, her voice sharp. "You seemed close." Paul felt his temper flare. "Are you serious right now? After everything you've done, you're going to accuse me of something because I talked to another parent?" Emily looked taken aback, but didn't back down. "I just think it's interesting," she said quietly. "Interesting?" Paul scoffed. "You got a lot of nerve, Emily." He turned and walked out of the room, slamming the door behind him. The next morning, Paul woke up with a sense of clarity. He couldn't keep living like this, constantly looking over his shoulder, constantly waiting for the next argument. He needed to take control of his life, not just for himself, but for Alex and Ethan. That day, he made an appointment with a family lawyer. The lawyer, a middle-aged woman named Cynthia Marks, greeted Paul warmly as he entered her office. "So, what brings you here today?" she asked, her tone professional but kind. Paul hesitated, unsure of how to condense the chaos of his life into a few sentences. "My wife, she's been unfaithful. It's been going on for months. I've tried to work through it, but I don't think I can anymore." Cynthia nodded, taking notes. "Do you have children?" "2 boys," Paul said, 9 and 6. "Your primary concern is custody then?" she asked. "Yes," Paul replied. "I want to make sure they're okay. I don't want to rip their lives apart, but I can't keep living like this." Cynthia leaned forward. "Let me explain how this works. Indiana is a no-fault divorce state, which means infidelity doesn't usually impact custody decisions. But the court does consider what's in the best interests of the children. If you can show that you've been the primary caregiver or that your home is more stable, you'll have a strong case." Paul nodded, feeling both relieved and overwhelmed. "Do you have any evidence of her affair?" Cynthia asked. Paul hesitated. "Just text messages I saw on her tablet." And she admitted to it. "That's a good start," Cynthia said. "We'll need to document everything. Your role in the children's lives, your financial contributions, even your daily routine. The more prepared we are, the stronger your case will be." Paul left the office feeling a mix of hope and dread. Filing for divorce felt like an irreversible step, but he knew it was the right one. That evening, as the boys played upstairs, Paul sat down with Emily in the kitchen. "I saw a lawyer today," he said bluntly. Emily's eyes widened. "What? Why?" "Because I can't do this anymore," Paul replied. "I've tried, Emily. I really have. But this marriage, it's broken." Emily stared at him, her face a mixture of shock and fear. "Paul, please. We can fix this. I know we can." Paul shook his head. "No, Emily. You broke it, and I can't keep pretending everything's okay. This isn't about punishment or revenge. It's about moving forward." Emily sat in stunned silence as Paul got up and walked out of the room. For the first time in months, he felt like he was finally taking control of his life. The days following Paul's announcement were tense and emotionally charged. Emily oscillated between pleading for another chance and lashing out in anger, accusing Paul of giving up too easily. Paul, meanwhile, focused on his boys, ensuring their lives remained as stable as possible amid the turmoil brewing at home. He kept the divorce discussions away from the boys, but their perceptiveness was undeniable. Alex, the older of the two, started asking more questions about why Mom and Dad were arguing. Ethan clung to Paul more often, as if sensing the uncertainty looming over their family. One evening, Emily cornered Paul in the living room after the boys were in bed. "Are you really going to do this?" she asked, her voice trembling. Paul sighed, setting down the book he'd been pretending to read. "Emily, I don't want to hurt you, but I can't keep living in a marriage that feels so empty." "But the boys," she said, her eyes filling with tears. "What about them? What will this do to them?" Paul's chest tightened. "I've thought about them more than anything else. That's why I stayed as long as I did. But kids aren't stupid, Emily. They can sense the tension. Staying together for their sake, while we're miserable, isn't doing them any favors." Emily looked down, tears streaming down her face. "I never wanted it to come to this," she whispered. Paul nodded, his voice softening. "Neither did I. But here we are." The following week, Paul officially filed for divorce. He met with Cynthia again to finalize the paperwork and discuss the next steps. Emily had hired a lawyer as well, but Paul suspected she wasn't prepared for what was coming. Cynthia was methodical in her approach, advising Paul to keep a detailed log of his time with the boys and any relevant interactions with Emily. Paul began documenting everything: school drop-offs, bedtime routines, even the meals he cooked for Alex and Ethan. He also started consolidating their finances. He opened a separate bank account for his paycheck, leaving enough in their joint account to cover household expenses. It was a practical move, but one that Emily noticed immediately. "What's this?" she asked one afternoon, holding up a bank statement. "I'm just making sure things are clear and fair," Paul replied. Emily's face darkened. "Fair? You think this is fair?" Paul didn't respond. He'd learned that arguing with her only led to more exhaustion. Despite the growing tension, Paul found solace in small moments with the boys. One Saturday, he took them to a local indoor rock climbing gym. Watching Alex and Ethan scale the walls, their laughter echoing through the space, gave Paul a sense of peace he hadn't felt in months. "Dad, look!" Alex shouted, reaching the top of a particularly challenging climb. "You're a natural," Paul called back, beaming with pride. For a few hours, he could forget about the divorce and focus solely on being a dad. Emily, meanwhile, struggled with the reality of their unraveling marriage. She confided in her closest friend, Megan, who tried to console her, but didn't hold back on honesty. "You knew this was a risk, Megan said during one of their coffee dates. "You can't expect him to just forgive and forget." "I wasn't ready to give up on him," Emily said, her voice breaking. I don't know what I was thinking." "You were thinking about yourself," Megan said bluntly. "And now you need to figure out how to live with the consequences." As the divorce proceedings moved forward, Paul and Emily's interactions became increasingly transactional. They discussed schedules, finances, and custody arrangements with a detached civility. One day, as they sat in a mediation session, Emily's lawyer suggested a 50-50 custody split. Paul bristled at the idea. "I've been the one taking care of the boys," Paul said firmly. "I make their meals, I help with homework, I take them to practice. Emily, she's been distant even before this." Emily's face turned red, but she didn't argue. Her lawyer suggested a cooling-off period, giving both sides time to revisit the arrangement. That evening, after the boys were asleep, Emily approached Paul in the kitchen. "I'm not going to fight you for custody," she said quietly. Paul looked at her surprised. "I've thought about it," she continued. "You're right. You've been more present for them than I have. I don't want to tear them apart by making this uglier than it needs to be." Paul nodded, a mixture of relief and sadness washing over him. "Thank you," he said simply. With custody resolved, the divorce process began to move more smoothly. Paul kept the house, ensuring stability for the boys, while Emily agreed to move into an apartment nearby. She would have visitation rights, and Paul made it clear that he would never stand in the way of her relationship with the boys, as long as it remained consistent and positive. Emily started packing her things, and the reality of their separation became impossible to ignore. One evening, as Paul walked past the living room, he saw her sitting on the couch, staring at an old photo album. "Do you ever think about how we got here?" she asked softly. Paul paused, then sat down across from her. "All the time," he admitted. She looked at him, her eyes filled with regret. "I'm sorry, Paul. For everything." Paul nodded. "I know." They sat in silence for a while, both mourning the life they had built and lost. By the time Emily moved out, the house felt quieter but lighter. Paul focused on creating a new sense of normalcy for Alex and Ethan, filling their days with activities, laughter, and love. One evening, after putting the boys to bed, Paul sat on the porch with a beer, staring at the stars. For the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of peace. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew he was ready to face it. With Emily gone, Paul was left with the daunting task of creating a stable, happy home for Alex and Ethan. The house felt emptier, but in some ways it also felt more alive. Without the constant tension of their fractured marriage, Paul found himself able to focus on the boys and, slowly, on rebuilding his own life. The first few weeks after Emily moved out were an adjustment for everyone. Alex and Ethan were confused but resilient, adapting to their new routine with an innocence that Paul envied. On their first weekend without Emily, Paul decided to take them on a camping trip. The boys were thrilled, helping Paul pack the car with sleeping bags, marshmallows, and fishing rods. "Are we going to see bears?" Ethan asked excitedly as they drove toward the state park. "Only if they like marshmallows," Paul replied with a grin. The trip was exactly what they needed. They hiked, fished, and told ghost stories around the campfire. For the first time in months, Paul felt a glimmer of hope that their family could find a new kind of happiness. Meanwhile, Emily was struggling to adjust to her new life. Her small apartment felt cold and lonely, a far cry from the warmth of the home she had shared with Paul and the boys. She called Alex and Ethan frequently, but hearing their voices only reminded her of how much she had lost. One evening, after a particularly long day at work, Emily sat alone on her couch, scrolling through old photos on her phone. There were pictures of family vacations, birthdays, and lazy Sundays spent baking cookies with the boys. She felt an ache deep in her chest, knowing she had traded those moments for something fleeting and meaningless. She wanted to reach out to Paul, to tell him how much she missed their life together. But she knew it was too late. Back at home, Paul was settling into a new routine. He found himself leaning more on the community around him. Parents from the boys' school, neighbors, and even Sarah, the soccer mom he had become friendly with. One Saturday, after Alex and Ethan's soccer game, Sarah approached Paul with a bright smile. "Hey, we're having a little barbecue at my place this afternoon," she said. "You and the boys should come by." Paul hesitated. He hadn't been to a social event in months and wasn't sure he was ready. But Alex overheard and chimed in. "Can we go, Dad? Please." Paul smiled. "Looks like we're in," he said. The barbecue was a casual, friendly affair. Paul watched as Alex and Ethan played with the other kids, their laughter filling the yard. For the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of normalcy. Sarah was a gracious host, making sure Paul had everything he needed and introducing him to her friends. As the afternoon wore on, they found themselves sitting together, talking about everything from parenting struggles to favorite movies. "You seem like a great dad," Sarah said at one point. Paul shrugged. "I'm trying. Some days it feels like I'm just winging it." Sarah laughed. "Aren't we all?" As the sun set, Paul realized he hadn't thought about the divorce all day. It was a small victory, but a meaningful one. That evening, after tucking the boys into bed, Paul sat on the couch and reflected on the day. He thought about how far he'd come since Emily's confession and how much further he still had to go. His phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. "Thanks for coming today. It was nice to see you," and the boys smile. Paul smiled, typing a quick reply. "Thanks for having us. It was a great day." The weeks turned into months, and Paul found himself embracing his new life. He continued running every morning, now joined occasionally by Alex, who was eager to train for his school's track team. He also spent more time with Sarah, though their relationship remained platonic for now. Emily, on the other hand, was struggling. Her relationship with Mark had fizzled out shortly after she moved out, and her attempts to reconnect with Paul had been met with polite but firm resistance. One evening, during her scheduled visit with the boys, Emily sat down with Paul at the kitchen table after Alex and Ethan had gone to bed. "I want to say I'm sorry," she began, her voice trembling. Paul looked at her, surprised. "I know I've hurt you in ways I can't take back," she continued. "And I know I've let the boys down too. I want to do better. I want to be a better mom for them." Paul nodded, his expression softening. "That's all I've ever wanted, Emily. For them to have a mom who's there for them. I miss them so much," she said, tears streaming down her face. "They miss you too," Paul said gently. "But you have to show them you're serious. Words aren't enough. They need to see it in your actions." Emily nodded, wiping her eyes. "I will. I promise." In the months that followed, Emily made genuine efforts to rebuild her relationship with Alex and Ethan. She attended their soccer games, helped with school projects, and even joined them on a few outings with Paul's blessing. Paul, meanwhile, continued focusing on his own growth. He and Sarah grew closer, their friendship slowly evolving into something more. One evening, as they sat on his porch watching the boys play in the yard, Sarah reached over and took Paul's hand. "You're doing an amazing job," she said. Paul smiled, squeezing her hand. "I couldn't have done it without you." By the time summer rolled around, life had taken on a new rhythm. Paul, Alex, and Ethan embarked on a road trip in a borrowed camper, exploring national parks and making memories that would last a lifetime. As they sat around a campfire one night, Alex turned to Paul and said, "This is the best summer ever, Dad." Paul smiled, his heart full. "It's just the beginning, buddy." For the first time in what felt like forever, Paul truly believed it. By the time fall arrived, life had begun to feel stable again for Paul and the boys. The rhythm of school, soccer, and quiet evenings at home provided a sense of security they hadn't felt in years. Paul found himself smiling more often, genuinely enjoying the small moments, helping Alex with his science project, watching Ethan master a new video game, or simply sitting on the porch with a cup of coffee. But beneath the surface, Paul knew change was inevitable. Emily's efforts to reconnect with the boys were sincere, and while Paul appreciated her renewed focus on their children, her presence often brought an undercurrent of unease. He could tell she was still hoping for reconciliation, but Paul had already accepted that their marriage was beyond repair. One evening, Paul received a text from Emily. "Emily, can we talk? I want to clear the air." Paul hesitated, staring at the message. He'd been avoiding these conversations, knowing they often led to arguments or guilt trips. But he also knew they couldn't keep dancing around the unresolved tension between them. "Paul, okay. Tomorrow after I drop the boys off." The next day, Paul met Emily at a small coffee shop near her apartment. She looked nervous, fidgeting with her cup as he sat down across from her. "Thanks for meeting me," she began, her voice tentative. Paul nodded, waiting for her to continue. I need to say this," she said, taking a deep breath. "I know I've made mistakes. Big ones. And I know I hurt you in ways I can never undo." Paul's expression softened, though he didn't interrupt. "I've spent so much time thinking about what went wrong," Emily continued. "And I realize now that it wasn't just about me needing something different. It was about me not appreciating what I already had. You, the boys, our life together. It was everything I could have wanted, and I took it for granted." Paul exhaled slowly, unsure of how to respond. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," Emily said quickly. "And I'm not asking for us to get back together. I just want you to know that I'm trying to be better for Alex and Ethan and for myself." Paul nodded, his voice calm. "I can see that, Emily. And I'm glad. The boys need you in their lives. They deserve the best version of you." Her eyes filled with tears, but she smiled. "Thank you, Paul. That means more than you know." As they left the coffee shop, Paul felt a weight lift from his shoulders. The conversation hadn't been easy, but it was necessary. For the first time, he felt like they were truly moving forward, not as a couple, but as co-parents dedicated to their children's happiness. Back at home, Paul found himself reflecting on how far he had come since the day he discovered Emily's affair. He had rebuilt his life piece by piece, focusing on the things that mattered most: his boys, his health, and his own sense of self-worth. He also thought about Sarah, whose presence had become a steadying force in his life. They hadn't officially defined their relationship, but Paul felt a sense of comfort and possibility with her that he hadn't felt in years. One Saturday, Sarah invited Paul and the boys over for dinner. Her son, Ben, had become fast friends with Alex and Ethan, and the three of them spent the evening playing video games while the adults chatted in the kitchen. "You've really created something special with your boys," Sarah said as she handed Paul a glass of wine. Paul smiled. "They've been my anchor through all of this. I don't know what I'd do without them." "You're a great dad," Sarah said, her voice warm. "And a good man. I hope you know that." Paul looked at her, his heart swelling with gratitude. "Thanks, Sarah. That means a lot." Later that evening, as they watched the kids play in the backyard, Sarah leaned her head on Paul's shoulder. It was a simple gesture, but it spoke volumes. For the first time in a long time, Paul felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. As the weeks turned into months, Paul and Sarah's relationship deepened. They took things slow, prioritizing their children while exploring what their future might look like together. Paul felt no rush. He had learned the value of patience and deliberate action. Emily, meanwhile, remained focused on rebuilding her relationship with Alex and Ethan. She continued attending their soccer games, joining them for weekend outings, and staying present in their lives. While her dynamic with Paul was no longer strained, it was clear that their paths had diverged for good. One evening, after tucking the boys into bed, Paul sat down with a stack of photo albums. He flipped through the pages, seeing memories of vacations, birthdays, and family milestones. He paused on a picture of himself and Emily, taken years ago during a beach trip. They were smiling, their arms around each other, radiating happiness. Paul studied the photo for a moment before closing the album. He didn't feel anger or regret, just a quiet acceptance. That chapter of his life was over, but it had taught him lessons he would carry with him forever. By the time spring arrived, Paul felt a renewed sense of purpose. He and Sarah had started planning a summer road trip with their children, a chance to explore new places and create new memories. One afternoon, as they discussed routes and destinations, Alex ran into the room holding a handmade card. "What's this?" Paul asked, smiling as he opened it. The card was decorated with colorful drawings of their family and a simple message, "Thank you for being the best dad ever." Paul's throat tightened as he hugged Alex. "Thank you, buddy. This means more to me than you know." As Alex ran off to play, Paul looked at Sarah, who was watching him with a soft smile. "You've come a long way," she said. Paul nodded, his heart full. "Yeah, and I'm ready for whatever comes next."